Hello. It's really good to be with you today. One of the things that being able to share with you is a reminder to me is that I'm not on my own. I know we're only sort of communicating virtually or whatever, but here I am as the leader of one Christian charity, being able to share with you working for another Christian-based charity. And that's a kind of encouragement that although our work is very different, the context we're working in is very different, we're not on our own. We're part of something much bigger. And that's what I want us to think about this morning, that actually all of us, we're part of something bigger. And hopefully that gives us a sense of encouragement and a sense of purpose too in what we're doing, that actually we're part of something that goes way back and that reaches right forward too to the end of time. This is about as big as it can get, actually. What do I mean by all that? Well, I want to start by reading some verses from 2 Timothy that hopefully will set this in a bit of context. 2 Timothy chapter 1. And Paul's writing to Timothy. Timothy was someone who he'd effectively trained up and put into leadership positions, but was quite young, and it would appear quite timid, maybe a little bit overwhelmed by what he was asked to do at times. And Paul writes to him to encourage him. And in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 3 he says this: I thank God whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. As night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you also. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For the Spirit God gave does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So Paul's writing to Timothy and he says, you're a little bit overwhelmed by the situation. And he draws his attention to two things. One, in verses 6 and 7, he draws his attention to the experience that Timothy personally and individually has had of God, and says, you've had this experience of God, and this means that you don't need to be timid, because the Spirit God gives is a spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline. But he doesn't just do that. And sometimes that's maybe where we've gone a bit wrong. We've been so focused on our own individual experience in our work context, but even in our spiritual lives, in our walk with God. Paul doesn't just do that. He starts by reminding Timothy that he's actually part of something bigger, that his spiritual life, his faith, has a history, has a heritage. He's part, if you like, of a tradition. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you also. There's a handing down, there's a heritage, there's a tradition there. What's really interesting in those verses is that Paul, this great pioneer in so many ways of what we now know as the Christian faith, the one who's often sort of held responsible for separating the followers of Jesus from traditional Judaism, starts off by saying, I thank God whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. In other words, he doesn't see what he's doing as some great break from the Jewish faith of his fathers. He sees it in continuity with it. He sees that what he is doing and what Timothy is doing is part of something big, something bigger than just them and their work. He sees them as part of a tradition. Now that can sometimes be, in Christian circles, a bit of a dirty word. We don't just want dead tradition, we want life. Maybe you've heard those sort of things said. But as the years have gone on, I've come to have a slightly different take on that and realised that tradition is often a really valuable thing, because we, as followers of Jesus, as part of a tradition with a capital T that goes all the way back to Jesus and to the disciples. Here's something to ponder if you can't sleep at night. One of my favourite quotes. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. I'm going to say that again. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. I don't know if you saw my expression. I had to think and make sure I'd got that right, but I did. Don't worry too much about that. But I think what it's saying is this, very simply, that tradition in itself is a good thing because it passes something. It's something that we've been given. We've not invented it and made it up ourselves. That's come to us from previous generations that we've got to look after. And we've got to be true to. As long as actually we don't then venerate that and put that in a place where we're worshipping the God of what we've been given by our forefathers, sort of thing. That's traditionalism. That's the dead stuff. That's the stuff we've got to avoid. You know, I don't know if you've ever been in this position. Maybe, you know, it depends on your own story. But if, like me, you grew up in a Christian home and following Jesus has always almost been part of your family history, you sometimes can sort of think, oh, if only I'd come from a really rough background, had this great personal testimony, or I used to be an axe murderer and then I found Jesus or something. And you can feel a bit shortchanged. But actually, Paul draws attention here to Timothy's heritage, his mother and his grandmother. And actually, he implies that's a really good thing to have that heritage. And actually, for all of us, if that's part of our heritage, there was a point at some point in our past, in our family past, where things changed. I'm in a slightly intriguing position, I guess, that I can trace some of that back. Having done some sort of family history research, it throws up some interesting things. So my great-grandfather, it turns out, was a German Jewish immigrant to the East End in the late 19th century via Australia. Bit of a shady character. Last seen on a ship to Mexico, having burnt through 2 fortunes, so the family legend goes. And actually not a great dad, and abandoned my grandpa when he was a young child. And my grandpa used to tell a story about, you know, his tweenage years, I suppose we call them now, 9, 10, 11, 12. He was hanging around with a gang in the East End of London, sleeping rough some of the time, not in a great place at all. And he says one Sunday afternoon, he walked into a Salvation Army hall and heard a woman preaching the cross. And his life changed that day. Not only his life, but actually our family history changed that day. If it wasn't for that Sunday afternoon and that nameless woman, and here's an irony, through the rest of his life as far as I remember him, my grandpa was an avid opponent of women preachers. But we won't dwell on that, the ironies of people. But if it wasn't for that woman, whose name I will never know, I wouldn't be sitting here today talking to you. I find that extraordinary, mind-blowing, quite literally. But actually, we've all got a spiritual family history. I think, again, if you like random thought experiments and can't sleep at night, have a ponder at this. Ultimately, I reckon all of us can trace our spiritual family history back to the disciples. Because someone must have told someone who told someone else who told someone else who led someone else to faith, and eventually that's come down to us. What an extraordinary thought that is. Pretty mind-blowing stuff. What on earth has all that got to do with what we're saying today? Well, it's a reminder that we are all part of something bigger. The work you do, however vital, however essential it is, didn't start and end with you. There's a story to it that we're part of. And that's both a reminder to us all to stay humble and an encouragement to us when it feels like what we're doing doesn't feel very significant. It's vital in the context of something that's bigger than just you. Paul goes on to talk to Timothy through the rest of this chapter, and he tells him to guard the deposit that's been given to him. But in the beginning of chapter 2, he says something else to him. He says, "You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." In other words, Timothy, you've inherited this. You've received something personally, but it's been passed on to you as part of this great line. And now your responsibility is to pass it on to others. He's part of the chain, I suppose, of transmission, of tradition. for the faith. And what I want us to see is that as long as there have been followers of Jesus, from the earliest days, they have been marked out as people who do good, as people who care for the vulnerable, for the dying, for the children, for those who the rest of society takes no notice of. That's part of the tradition of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So whether it's working in schools with children who are broken very often and have often been through incredible things over the months of lockdown and whose lives have been turned upside down, or working with the dying in Eastern Europe, bringing hope where there wasn't any hope before, we're part of a tradition that goes all the way back to Jesus, because his followers have always been marked out as those who do good. And I think that should be a massive encouragement to us, that what we're doing, so often it seems like all the odds are stacked against us, that actually it's hard work, frankly, and it doesn't seem like we're making any headway, or that if we are, there's still so much more need that needs to be met. And how do we do that? And all those things are realistic and valid responses to the situation we find ourselves in. But this isn't new. We serve a big God, and we are part of something huge. We're part of a tradition. We're part of a story that goes all the way back to Jesus, that goes back beyond that ultimately to Abraham, to Adam. We're part of what God is doing in the world, because God hasn't left the world in the mess that came about because of human beings' wrong choices. He's done something about it, and he's carrying on doing something about it through this people he's gathered together who follow Jesus. He's bringing about hope and healing and new life and new creation, the Bible calls it. And one day that comes to culmination when Jesus returns. However dark the situation looks, however bleak things look in our work, in our personal lives, in the situations that we're facing, in the world around us, we've read to the end of the book and we know who wins. And we, in some extraordinary way, have got the incredible privilege of being part of the story that leads to that victory. Every little bit of hope we bring, every contribution we make to bringing light in darkness is part of this massive story that God's writing. We are part of a tradition that goes back to Jesus and his first followers and will carry on until the end of time. The wonderful thing is, it won't be permanent, because one day every tear will be wiped away. And so the tradition we're part of, the work we're part of, won't be needed anymore. But while it is, let's be encouraged. We're part of something big. You may feel that what you're doing is just a tiny little contribution, but it's part of the biggest story ever written. It's part of what God is doing to put right this world that has gone wrong. So be encouraged. You're part of a big story, and we serve a big God. I hope that encourages you. Have a good week. God bless.